An unanswered question at the intersection of neuroscience, metabolism, and pharmacology Part 2, number 1677, the 9th of June 2026, Gerald C. Hsu, Eclairem Foundation. Body of information. During the work process regarding my pre-stroke versus post-stroke glucose data, an interesting observation emerged. At present, I do not have a definitive explanation for this finding, but I believe it is important to document the observation itself before searching for answers. The data comparison revealed several clear differences. 1. The annual average glucose increased from 103 mg DL to 114 mg DL, representing an increase of approximately 11%. 2. The peak glucose increased from approximately 115 mg DL to 133 mg DL, representing an increase of approximately 16%. 3. The glucose peak became noticeably broader. The post-stroke glucose plateau lasted approximately 2 hours longer than the pre-stroke plateau. 4. The area under the glucose curve increased as a result of both the higher glucose level and the longer duration of elevated glucose. 5. The combination of greater glucose height and longer exposure time resulted in a larger glucose-associated energy exposure. From a physics perspective, this increased energy may impose greater stress on cerebral blood vessels and surrounding biological tissues. 6. The altered glucose profile persisted for approximately 1 year. This observation period was selected because my post-stroke recovery period currently spans approximately 1 year. These observations are supported directly by the measured data. The most interesting feature may not be the higher glucose peak itself. Instead, the broader peak suggests that glucose remained elevated for a longer period of time during the day. In engineering terms, the entire glucose waveform shifted upward and widened. At first glance, one possible explanation might be the increased energy demand associated with post-stroke brain recovery and neuroplasticity. However, this explanation remains a hypothesis. While it may be plausible, it has not yet been supported by sufficient quantitative evidence or proven through deterministic analysis. The data prove the observation, but they do not prove the mechanism. Additional factors complicate the interpretation. Following the stroke, several variables changed simultaneously, including reduced physical activity, increased sleep duration, initiation of chemotherapy for seizures, and daily use of 1,000 mg metformin. An interesting aspect of this observation is that the glucose increase occurred despite daily metformin therapy. Therefore, the post-stroke glucose elevation cannot be simply attributed to the absence of glucose-lowering treatment. This led to a broader discussion regarding research methodology. Many biomedical studies begin with a hypothesis and then collect data to test that hypothesis. My own approach has generally been different. I first collect large amounts of quantitative data, identify reproducible patterns, and then search for explanations. In this case, I did not begin with a theory that stroke recovery would increase average glucose levels by 11% and peak glucose levels by 16%. Instead, the data revealed an unexpected phenomenon. Only afterward did the search for an explanation begin. However, at this moment, I still cannot identify a convincing explanation for this observed pattern. This observation may be particularly interesting because it lies at the intersection of 3 disciplines: -1-to-1, neuroscience, stroke recovery and neuroplasticity; 2, metabolism, glucose utilization and energy demand; 3, pharmacology, daily metformin therapy and metabolic response. Although these fields are individually well studied, I am not aware of many reports examining this specific combination through a longitudinal dataset consisting of continuous pre-stroke and post-stroke glucose measurements from the same individual. At present, the most scientifically rigorous conclusion is straightforward. The data clearly demonstrate a persistent post-stroke increase and broadening of the glucose waveform. However, the pathophysiological mechanism responsible for this change remains unknown. Nevertheless, the observation itself is real, reproducible, and quantitatively documented. Sometimes scientific progress begins not with an answer, but with a question. This may be one of those questions. Epilogue. This paper does not attempt to provide an answer. Instead, it raises a question. The observed glucose profile after my stroke differed from the profile before stroke in several measurable ways, including a higher average glucose, a higher peak glucose, a broader peak width, and a larger overall glucose exposure. These observations are supported by quantitative data, but the mechanism responsible for these changes remains uncertain. An additional factor should be acknowledged. During the approximately 11.5-month post-stroke observation period, I continuously took 1,000 milligrams of metformin daily. This medication had not been part of my regimen during the preceding 16 to 17 years. Therefore, metformin was one of the variables present in the observed picture. However, based on the available data, I am unable to determine the magnitude or direction of metformin's influence on the observed glucose profile. For me, life is a movie rather than a collection of snapshots. This paper represents approximately 70,000 frames within a 2-year-long movie recorded before and after my stroke. The data revealed a reproducible pattern. The pattern is documented in this paper. The question it raises remains unanswered. Perhaps the answer already exists somewhere in the scientific literature. Perhaps future studies will provide a convincing explanation. Perhaps they will not. Nevertheless, I believe the observation itself is sufficiently interesting and quantitatively documented to warrant preservation and discussion. Sometimes scientific progress begins not with an answer, but with carefully recorded data. A reproducible observation and a well-documented question. I do not claim to have the answer. I am simply following the path taken by many scientists throughout history. Observe carefully, measure objectively, document honestly, and ask questions. Whether an answer eventually emerges is less important than ensuring that a potentially meaningful observation is not lost. Although a disease may involve thousands of interacting factors, effective management often begins by identifying and controlling the few dominant variables that exert the greatest influence on system behavior. Observe carefully, measure objectively, document honestly, and ask questions. Whether an answer eventually emerges is less important than ensuring that a potentially meaningful observation is not lost. Although a disease may involve thousands of interacting factors, effective management often begins by identifying and controlling the few dominant variables that exert the greatest influence in system behavior. For my own health concerns, I will continue doing my very best to lower my glucose height, breadth, and duration while maintaining strict control of my systolic blood pressure (SBP), whether or not I fully understand all of the underlying mechanisms. I firmly believe that this is the right path for me to reduce the risk of a second stroke during my remaining years. This study shows that after the stroke, the daily glucose curve changed in several ways. It shifted upward, stayed high for a longer time, and developed a clear double peak pattern. We do not yet know why this happened. The changes may result from the combined effects of the brain injury, the body's metabolism, medications, and the way the body adapts after a stroke, rather than from a single cause. More research involving experts from different medical fields will be needed to determine whether this represents a new type of long-term change in glucose regulation after a pontine hemorrhage. This paper is not primarily about glucose. Instead, it is about how an entire biological control system may reorganize after a neurological injury. The altered glucose curve serves as a measurable biomarker of that system-level change. What is being documented is a persistent deformation in the body's regulatory behavior rather than simply a change in glucose values. The underlying mechanism remains unknown, but the findings suggest that the brain, metabolism, medications, and the body's adaptive processes may all interact to create a new long-term operating state. Detecting and describing this type of complex biomedical phenomenon is particularly well suited to a mathematical, physical, and engineering approach that focuses on patterns, trajectories, and system behavior over time. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C. Shue.